hardest part was keeping a good supply of food.
Down my burdens, down by...
I was the first man to paint a portrait of every bird in North America.
It was also at Cambridge that I met Reverend Henslow.
My life flows on in endless flow of water. Scouting those rebels. There were rebels behind them.
In today's episode of History in Person, we meet a German immigrant who settled in Peoria, was the first to enlist in the Civil War, and fought in every major battle. Mathias Stritt tells a soldier's tale.
In 1861, hurroo, hurroo, that was when the war begun, hurroo, hurroo. In 1862, the greycoats fought the boys in blue. Oh, my dear, who shed a tear when Johnny comes marching home? Well do I remember that day when General Beauregard fired his cannons on Fort Sumter. The echo of that cannon rang out from Charleston Bay to San Francisco, from the Rocky Mountains to the Appalachians and around the globe, drawing the eyes of tyrants and despots who scoffed at our experiments in freedom and democracy, hoping this union would fail. When our matchless and immortal president, Abraham Lincoln, called for 30,000 troops to save the Union, 60,000 rose up. And later, when he called for 100,000 more, 300,000 stepped forward. Eventually, 2.5 million Americans rose up out of the dust and smoke and confusion, not in vengeance to destroy our enemy, but to save the greatest nation the sun doth shine upon. And we were met by 1.5 million Americans. Yes, Americans, as hell-bent on the destruction of this nation as we were on its preservation. What would cause a man to leave the comforts at home for the rigors of the battlefield? Would any of you leave a warm and easy bed for cold nights sleeping on the frozen ground? Would you give up clean clothes for infested rags? Would you give up your mother's good home cooking for mealy pork, stale hardtack, and bad coffee? Would you give up love for hate and the systematic organized murder of your fellow Americans? I heard the call. I enlisted. I was the first to sign the rolls, joining Illinois' 11th Cavalry. My name is Mathias Stritt. I was born in Württemberg, Germany, more than 40 years ago. My father came to this country when I was but a boy, barely 10 years old, seeking the freedoms that were promised by this land, fleeing the despots and tyranny of Germany and the petty fiefdoms and lesser kingdoms. We settled first in Wisconsin, where a man could own his own land, grow food to feed his family, and not the baron who always took the first share. When I was a young man, I moved to Peoria, where my skills in steel were highly valued, and I got a job at the Peoria Plow Works. It was 1861, when the war begun. In 1861, hurroo, hurroo, that was when the war begun, hurroo, hurroo. In 1862, the greycoats fought the boys in blue. Oh, my dear, who'll shed a tear when Johnny comes marching home? As you may well know, in the early days of the war, it wasn't going well for the boys in blue. General Winfield Scott had led the troops ably in the war against Mexico, but by the time the Civil War rolled around, he was too old to ride a horse, let alone lead men into battle. At that first battle of Bull Run, Tourists came out with picnic baskets to watch the proceedings from a distant hill. But Johnny Reb overran our position, and the tourists had to flee back to Washington City. Why, if the Graycoats would have been better supplied, they might have marched right into Washington and ended the war in the first battle. So Lincoln went through a series of mediocre to bad generals. Hooker, Meade, McLellan. Oh, you know McLellan? If you know McLellan, then you know he had a serious case of the slews. Not once, but twice, he had a chance to capture Robert E. Lee and end the war in the early days, but he who hesitates is lost. And with his hesitation, nearly everything was lost. He had the audacity to call Father Abraham, as we knew him, he called President Lincoln a baboon. And one time, Lincoln came calling, and General McLellan told his servant that he was taking a nap, and he would see the president later, and chased the president away. Another time, he telegraphs Lincoln saying, "I need more horses." And Lincoln telegraphs back, "Why do you need more horses when you're not using the ones you have?" Another time, Lincoln telegraphs McLellan and says, "If you aren't going to put those soldiers to use, may I borrow them for a season?" McLellan and the Grand Army of the Potomac. Our first real victories came here in the Western Theater with men and boys from Illinois. Maybe you don't know, but Illinois enlisted more men in the Civil War than any other state except New York. But they had twice the population, and yet we still enlisted nearly as many men. Our first real victories came here with Grant. I fought with Grant at Belmont when Grant very wisely used steamboats. He could bring a lot of men all at once. We unloaded from the boat. We chased the Confederates out of town into a cornfield before they quickly reorganized and chased us back through the same cornfield. The Confederates passed 3 corn rows away from Grant. If they would have captured him in the early days of the war, that might have changed everything. We got back on board the steamboats and we raced away. They helped us to enter the battle and make our escape. Now, both sides at Belmont wanted to claim a victory, but I was there. At best, it was a draw. Then we floated on downriver to Fort Henry. Now, Fort Henry was built in a floodplain, and the river was at flood stage, so it was very easy to get the steamboats in, and we hammered the fort for 3 days with more than 300 cannonballs an hour. You do the math. The Confederates hightailed. They fled across the isthmus from the Tennessee River to the Cumberland River, and they settled in at Fort Donelson. Well, we marched across that isthmus, and we chased them into the fort, and we locked them down. General Pillow, the Confederate commander, he looked out and he saw the Union forces amassed against him, and once more he got this idea that he was going to hightail and run. Early the next morning, before the sun rose, his troops prepared to make their exit. Now that night, it had been a freezing cold rain. And we woke up in the morning, literally frozen to the ground. And just as we were awakening, 10,000 Confederate troops came pouring out of the fort straight towards our position. We not only held our ground, but we pushed them back in. I watched as Logan, at that point not yet general, he not only held his ground, but he defeated the Confederates. He took a bullet in the leg and he kept riding, he being on a horse. He took another one in the rib cage and it knocked him off his horse. Now, when the medic said, you need to stay here in the tent, he said, no. As long as my boys got fight, I need to be there leading the charge. And he got back on his horse. A third minie ball in the shoulder knocked him from his horse. He fell to the ground. He bled out, was given up for dead. But because the 31st, the infantry from Southern Illinois, held their ground and pushed them back, Pillow waved the white flag and surrendered. Our first real victory at Fort Donelson. And then we marched on further south to Shiloh. Oh, do you folks know about Shiloh? Until that day, it was the bloodiest day in American history. More than 23,000 killed, wounded, or missing in action. More than 23,000 casualties. Casualties? There's nothing casual about the systematic organized murder of your fellow Americans. Gray coats and blue coats, we all bleed red. I know it sounds like a dark cliche, but I saw with my own eyes. The river ran red with the blood of the fallen. There's one pond still called Bloody Pond because by the end of the day, it was probably more blood than water. We were fighting in the hornet's nest. The hornet's nest because all day long, mini balls are whizzing by your head like a swarm of hornets. They actually cut down trees, one mini ball at a time, and the tree fell over because of the impact of so many bullets. Shiloh was a victory. The cost immeasurable in lives, but it was a victory. And generals back east, they grew jealous of Grant and his victories. They started spreading this ugly rumor that Grant had a problem with the battle. Now, I do know Grant liked a good drink now and then, but I never, ever saw him drink once as we were going into battle. The sorrow afterwards would cause any man's heart to weep. But this general back east who spread the rumor, it's reported that when Lincoln heard it, he said, and I quote, "Find out what he's drinking and buy a case for all of my generals. At least Grant is winning." And we marched on down to Corinth. Now, at Corinth, it was actually General Halleck who led the charge. Halleck was known as Old Brains, for without a doubt, he was probably one of the most intelligent officers, had written books on strategy. But Old Brains took so much time surveying the situation, surmising what option to pursue, that by the time he acted, the Confederates had hightailed it. They literally put dummies in their embattlements, and they left in the middle of the night. So when we finally charged into town, we were shooting on scarecrows. But it was a victory because Corinth was a rail hub, and they could bring in food, hogs and hominy from the west to feed the soldiers in the east. And once we cut off those supplies, we knew eventually we could starve them out. And we marched on down to Vicksburg. Do you folks know about Vicksburg? Vicksburg was a mighty pretty town. Yeah, Vicksburg was a mighty pretty town. To the Union we came and we just burned it down. Yes, Vicksburg was a mighty pretty town. Vicksburg is built on a bluff above the Mississippi River where it does a series of hairpin curves, with the Yazoo River coming in from the north and an impenetrable swamp on the south. And them being on this bluff, they could fire down on us, and it was hard to fire back. Grant actually tried to dig a canal to connect those hairpin turns so the boats could get south, but while we were digging that canal, the river ran low. So in the middle of the night, he loads steamboats with bales of cotton and tries to run the gauntlet. We got past Vicksburg, and we marched over land from Raymond to Port Charles to Raymond to Jackson. We captured the capital of Mississippi, and then we chased them to Champions Hill and back into Vicksburg. Once we locked them down, we'd claim the river, and we claimed their escape route. We lay in siege. That means you starve them out. For 60 days, they were eating shoe leather. They'd already killed the mules and dogs and cats and rats. They were starving. Finally, they waved the white flag. And when Vicksburg fell, oh, maybe I should stop and ask, do you know your American history? Do any of you know? What day did Vicksburg finally surrender? You know your history better than they did. It was the 4th of July. Maybe they don't pay attention to American history books, but what a monumental day. All the headlines, newspapers across the country. Vicksburg surrenders on Independence Day. Vicksburg liberated on Independence Day. It buoyed up the nation. And Lincoln later said, "The Mississippi now flows unvexed unto the sea." And Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, he said that Vicksburg was the tack that holds the two halves of the South together. And now that was torn asunder. Well, from Vicksburg, we marched overland. And eventually, because Grant was winning battle after battle, he was made the supreme commander of all Union forces, and he moved to Washington. And so our unit then came under the command of General Sherman. And Sherman marched towards Atlanta. Battle after battle, the real battle for Atlanta, was in the days and weeks leading up to Atlanta. Atlanta fell, but not after months of struggle. And finally, when Atlanta went down, the Confederates started the fire. Now, I know the history book says Sherman burned Atlanta, but that's not true at all. When the Confederates fled, it made sense for them to burn the warehouses where they had armaments stored, so we couldn't claim their muskets and gunpowder and lead. And then they burned the cotton warehouses, and Atlanta was another railroad hub. And by burning all that cotton, it meant it didn't fall into the hands of Northerners, profiteers, who would sell that cotton that they got for virtually nothing, except for the shipping cost, and make money on the war. There's always a profiteer following a Union army. And Grant did say, and I don't know if this is a quote, he said, "I did not burn Atlanta. The Confederates started the fire, and I was in no hurry to put it out." From Atlanta, we marched the sea. Sherman and his troops, we left a swath of destruction 100 miles wide, pillaging property. Any animal, "Ma'am, you got a chicken? Not resting too careful? We care to eat that chicken for you." "Oh, Uncle Sam, he'll send you an IOU." Some say the scars of Sherman's March left on the land have not yet healed. But eventually we arrived in Savannah. And on Christmas Day, Sherman sends a telegram to the President of the United States, giving Lincoln Savannah as a Christmas present. We had enacted Grant's plan. Actually, the plan goes back a little further. It was Winfield Scott who originally came up with what he called the Anaconda Plan. We'll surround them and we'll squeeze them. Grant made that come true and added his own twist by cutting them in half. They cannot survive and had no choice but to surrender. It was just shortly thereafter that Lee and Grant met at Appomattox. But there's another piece of this story that I think it's important you hear. Some folks wonder about the colored troops. I fought alongside the colored troops, and I will tell you, they fought as bravely as any man. They weren't fighting for some high-minded idea of freedom. They were fighting for their mother's freedom and their father's freedom. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, not only giving the black man their freedom, but recruiting them to join the army. In 1863, hurroo, hurroo, Lincoln set the coloreds free, hurroo, hurroo. In 1864, Abraham called 500,000 more. Oh, my dear, who shed a tear when Johnny comes marching home? There's no doubt the colored troops helped to win this war. Again, they weren't fighting for some high-minded idea of freedom. They were fighting for their mother's freedom, for their wives' and children's freedom. They were the bravest soldiers on the field in battle after battle. And eventually, as we marched from Atlanta to the sea, when we captured Savannah and we sent it to Lincoln on a telegraph, it was shortly thereafter that Lee and Grant met at Appomattox. Here's another story maybe you don't know, that Grant went to West Point when Robert E. Lee was a professor there. How well they knew each other, I can't exactly say. But in the war against Mexico, Grant was little more than a supply sergeant, and Lee was a commanding officer, but they fought together on the same side, the right side, the Union side. So when Grant and Lee fell into each other as enemies, I don't know how well they knew each other as men, but clearly Grant knew Lee's strategies. He called it a game of devil's arithmetic. Grant even said, I could lose more men in every battle and still win the war through a war of attrition. But the price we paid at Fredericksburg and Gettysburg, why Gettysburg alone, this was before Grant took charge, 54,000 casualties in 3 days of fighting. Well, that's more men than the entire Revolutionary War. Actually, more men were lost in the Civil War than several wars added up together. If you count the gray coats as well as the blue coats, we all were Americans. Though many made the wrong decision and fought for the wrong side, traitors to this country. So when Lee and Grant met at Appomattox and the treaties were signed, the war was over. I was among the lucky. Obviously, I survived. In my unit, 9 men lost their lives on the battlefield. But no, that wasn't just the first battle. 35 men died as a direct result of the war. But 235 more died of disease, gangrene, infection, amputation, starvation, killed more men than a musket ball. I was among the lucky. I caught a mini ball in the leg, but it was through and through. I recovered and I kept fighting. After the war was over, I headed home. I returned to my job at the Peoria Plow Works, grinding steel, breathing the emery dust. It settled in my lungs. And eventually, I developed consumption. There was a point where I had trouble breathing, let alone working or even standing. I did recover some, obviously, after I quit the plow works. But the money I saved, I invested in a pub on Water Street in downtown Peoria. It became the first unofficial meeting place of the Grand Army of the Republic, the GAR. And just as I was the first to sign the list when I enrolled, I was the first to sign the list at the formation of the Grand Army of the Republic. And my saloon became an unofficial meeting place. If only the walls could talk, the stories they could tell. Night after night, soldiers would come to wallow in their misery, to drown their sorrows, to bask in their joys. Though I tell you, the sorrows were many and the joys were few. Maybe you have an elder who fought under Sherman or Grant, Stonewall Jackson or Robert E. Lee. Learn their stories. Talk to your elders. Collect those stories so we will never forget. Eventually, more than 500,000 men gave their lives for the freedoms that some people take for granted. 500,000 more were maimed, lost a limb. Some say the scars on the inside take the longest to heal. I tell you, lest we forget, there were 500,000 widows who will never see their husband again. 500,000 orphans who will never see their pa. Learn their stories so we will never forget. In 1865, hurroo, hurroo, that was when we ended strife, hurroo, hurroo. In 1865, we buried the dead and thank God for our lives. Oh, my dear, who'll shed a tear when Johnny comes marching home?
You can do this. It's really not that hard. First, pick a character where you feel comfortable in their skin. I love Abraham Lincoln, but I'm not tall enough, so I play several friends of Lincoln. One of my favorite is Billy Herndon, his law partner. So if you can, read what they wrote, and then read for context. Think about not just Lincoln's Herndon, but Herndon's Lincoln, and make those connections. I also love to read about the time period, so Life on the Eighth Circuit, this is one of my favorite books, and of course, you could read one of my books. I've written several as various friends of Lincoln. And then once you've read, you don't have to tell their whole life story. Just one or two really pivotal moments in their life. And then think about costuming. I collect hats. And depending on who I'm portraying, I will have a different hat for that character, because the hats really help the character to come to life. practice, 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 and then send me a film of what you have recorded, of your favorite historical character, and we might use it on the next episode of History in Person.